presentation, I will discuss the basic principles of dual coding theory. This theory was theorized by Alan Pavio in 1971. He is a professor emeritus at the University of Western Ontario. From an historical perspective, this theory is the first systematic scientific attempt to bridge two traditions in philosophy and psychology, the imagery tradition and the verbal tradition. In their article, Clark and Pavio present dual coding theory as a general framework for educational psychology with a focus on educational research and teacher education. As they address the dual coding theory, explains human behavior and experience in terms of dynamic associative processes that operate on a rich network of modality-specific verbal and nonverbal representation. The first assumption of dual coding theory is that the mental cognition involves the activity of two cognitive subsystems, verbal system and nonverbal system. The second assumption is that there is a continuity between perception and memory. As mentioned before, mental cognition involves the activity of two cognitive subsystems, verbal system and nonverbal system. The difference between these two systems is that the verbal one contains word-like codes called logogens that symbolize concrete and abstract ideas. Logogens are organized in terms of associations and hierarchies. These codes are processed in a sequential manner. Nonverbal system contains non-linguistic objects called imagens. Examples of imagens are images, sounds, actions, visceral sensations to emotions. Images are organized in terms of part-whole relationships, and information is encoded in parallel and simultaneously. Dual coding theory identifies three types of processing: representational, which refers to the direct activation of verbal or nonverbal representations; referential or crossing the aisle, which regards the activation between the verbal and nonverbal systems. It leads to imaging to words or naming to pictures. Associative activation occurs within the verbal or nonverbal system. According to dual coding theory, a given task might require any or all of the three kinds of processing. This model has implications in terms of activation characteristics. There are three main factors that affect the speed or likelihood that words will activate mental images. The first is represented by the extent to which the imagery system has been primed by instruction to pre-image or by use of images. The second is the imagery value or concreteness of material, and the third is the variable natural tendency and the capacity of the subject to use imagery. This information can be applied to create successful lessons plans or multimedia. For example, according to the dual coding theory, the use of images linked to words and of concrete and vivid language might assist learners with processing on complex material. Dual coding theory is based on the common assumption of a continuity between perception and memory. External experiences occur when people's senses are stimulated and encoded in memory traces that keep some of their original concrete qualities as words and things. The theory is therefore multimodal because both verbal and nonverbal experiences can occur in different sense modalities, including vision, hearing, and touch in the case of language, and all five senses in the case of mental images. The main implication of the theory is that pictures or concrete language should be understood and recollected better than abstract language. This diagram represents the verbal and nonverbal symbolic systems of dual coding theory. As we can see from this diagram, once people's senses are stimulated and encoded in memory traces, learners use separate channels to process words and pictures, verbal and nonverbal systems. This diagram also shows the representational units and their referential between systems and associative interconnections within each system. Preceding sections have demonstrated the importance of imagery, concreteness, and verbal associative processes for comprehension and memory of school material. It is expected that these factors influence the effectiveness of teaching. In 1929, Schwartz and Waples conducted a study called Commonwealth Teacher Training Study with the purpose of documenting teaching activities. In their study, both teachers and administrators created several different teaching traits and activities. The resulting items were categorized and rated based on dimensions and importance. One large category of activity, which they called teaching subject matter, included a large number of pedagogical practices aimed at emphasizing the role of concreteness and imagery in teaching. These activities related to imagery included using effective pictures, diagrams, models, and other illustrations for lessons. In addition, they show the relationship between school subject and events in real life. The research on teacher effectiveness has led educational psychologists and educators to adopt instructional methods that can be conceptualized in terms of imaginal processes. For instance, using concrete examples and/or illustrations. Visual illustrations, the use of concrete and personal examples, and relating teaching behaviors help learners to comprehend and retain lessons by activating concrete reference and increasing the stimulation of mental image. Verbal associative processes contribute to the effectiveness of instruction through activities called associative organizations. Examples of associative organization include developing outlines for lessons, arrange units into orderly sequences, try to summarize the idea that they are teaching, and generally attempt to organize their subject matter knowledge. So far, we have discussed the role of cognitive systems that are verbal and nonverbal. There are non-cognitive factors that play a big role in the transfer of knowledge. Dual coding theory explains phenomena that are less cognitive in nature, emotions and motor skills. Emotions can be a complex pattern of activation among interconnected nonverbal and verbal representation. The article addresses two different emotions pertinent to education. The first is achievement motivation, which students can feel when, for instance, they are receiving a diploma at a graduation. The second is anxiety. For example, many students experience stage fright when they are delivering a presentation or they have an oral exam. Persistent activation of positive or negative emotions affect students' attitudes towards school and their emotional responses to school. Nonverbal components of motor skills include kinesthetic and visual images. Kinesthetic refers to the feel of the action from an internal perspective. For instance, printing letters or numbers, playing an instrument, and articulating a sound in a foreign language. Visual imagery refers to the appearance of actions from the perspective of an external viewer. For example, what the preceding actions would look like if another person performed the action. Verbal components also contribute to the dual coding theory view of motor skills, including verbal representation as names for specific acts, words for general qualities, and names for particular pattern produced by that movement. Motor skills are involved in many regular classroom activities. Examples of these activities include printing and writing, articulation of speech sounds, typing, physical education, art and music, and manual skills involved in the use of equipment in vocational and laboratory class. The purpose of education is to transfer knowledge. Dual coding theory suggests that lessons containing concrete information and evoking vivid images will be easier to understand and remember than lessons that are abstract. Furthermore, this theory provides theoretical mechanisms that are useful in comprehending less cognitive domains as emotions and motor skills. Dual coding theory principles explain cognitive, affective, and sensory motor phenomena of interest to teachers and education psychologists.